When Janie Barella disappeared on April 14, 2004, nobody suspected that the truth would be more horrifying than anyone imagined. She was only 15 years old, a kid with a quiet laugh, nervous energy, and a family who loved her. In the months before she vanished, Janie had spent afternoons at family gatherings in her neighborhood on Albuquerque's south side, trading jokes with cousins, complaining about school, and planning for maybe a better future. Her cousin, Evelyn Salazar, a young woman in her 20s, often watched out for her. The two were close, sort of like sisters. Evelyn had dreams too, though they had already grown heavy with reality. She danced at parties sometimes, had a few bad nights, and often found herself walking risky streets when she needed money. She wasn't proud of that life, not really, but she saw no easy way out. Their story was sadly not unique in Albuquerque at that time. The early 2000s were rough on many young women in the city's underbelly. Some struggled with addiction, many were living on the margins, transient, under-resourced, often ignored. For them, survival sometimes meant making hard, painful choices. Survival sometimes meant sex work, the kind of sex work that put a target on your back. Another woman, Michelle Valdez, was in her early 20s and pregnant. She hoped, perhaps, for a fresh start, a child, a chance at something better. But like many of the others, she had fallen into the trap of desperation. There was Veronica Romero, smart and vibrant, someone who had friends, occasionally ambitions, and for a while tried to do things differently. Then there was Victoria Chavez, who loved the outdoors and once joked about wanting to leave the city behind, a hopeful but fragile longing, and many more, women whose lives were ordinary in so many ways until circumstances spun them into danger. These were not anonymous victims. These were mothers, daughters, nieces, friends. They had names, memories, and people who turned their world upside down when they stopped coming home. But because their lives were messy by society's standards, because they came from the margins, their disappearances often went unnoticed. No one assumed their absence meant hate or horror. In many cases, few even reported them missing. Still, among their friends and families, worry grew. Someone would call, "Have you heard from Victoria?" Or, "Did you see Michelle around?" Sometimes days passed, then weeks, then months, and then silence. The pain was personal, real, but for many outside that circle, it was just another disappearance, another street worker gone. In 2009, everything changed. The dry desert wind swept across the barren land on the West Mesa, a once empty stretch of desert just west of Albuquerque's urban sprawl. Developers had drawn plans for housing, for subdivisions. The land had been plotted for growth but then left vacant when the housing bubble burst. The arroyo banks and sandy soil lay exposed, dusty, quiet, waiting. On February 2nd, Christine Ross took her dog for a walk along a dusty trail near 188th Street, SW. The dog stirred the sand, and the sand gave up a secret, a human bone, half buried, half forgotten. The bone was a femur. Something about it made her uneasy. She took a photo and sent it to her sister, a nurse. Her sister called it human. Christine called the police. That call started what would become the largest homicide investigation in the history of the city. Over the coming weeks, across dozens of acres of barren earth, shallow graves were uncovered, graves holding the remains of women who had vanished years earlier. Women like Jamie, like Evelyn, like Michelle, Veronica, Victoria, and others. And for the first time, the names behind the disappearances began to matter to the world outside their small circles. Their faces, their stories, their human lives. And with each exhumed skeleton, the silence around their disappearances turned into grief, outrage, sorrow. But even as the bones were laid bare, almost nothing else was. Names were assigned, families gathered, memories poured out. But the questions, the most important questions, remained unanswered. Who had done this? Why? And how many more remained undiscovered? Even as the city stared into the abyss of the unknown, a grim suspicion took root. These deaths were not random. These women were not victims of accidents or one-off tragedies. Something darker, more methodical had reached into their lives. If you had walked the same streets, if you had ignored the whispers, if you had looked away, maybe you would never have noticed. But now, with the graves exposed, there was no turning back. And on that February day in 2009, when a dog walker simply strolled the desert trails, a quiet reckoning began. It would not be the reckoning anyone expected. When Christine Ross crouched beside the pale fragment of bone on February 2, 2009, she had no idea she was about to uncover a hidden graveyard stretching across the West Mesa. She simply held her phone, snapped a picture, and wondered why something about the shape made her uneasy. Her dog tugged gently at the leash, restless, but Ross stayed still, staring at that single bone, half covered, half exposed, as if the desert itself had grown tired of keeping secrets. Within hours, the area was swarming with officers and the excavation began. But long before that morning, long before shovels cut into the crusted desert sand, something far more sinister had already taken place. The disappearances had started quietly, almost invisibly, between 2001 and 2005. A woman seen on a corner one week would be gone the next. Another would fail to make a promised call home. Someone would mention casually that they hadn't seen Cinnamon Elks lately, or that Victoria Chavez hadn't been around in days. At first, no one connected these vanishings, because the women lived hard lives, because addiction and homelessness and sex work meant constantly shifting locations, constantly changing circumstances. A woman disappearing for a week wasn't unusual. A woman disappearing for a year raised little alarm if no one knew exactly where she'd been to begin with. This was the perfect cover for a predator. Someone who understood that the world would not notice when these particular women vanished. Police reports from the early 2000s showed scattered missing person filings, but most were vague, incomplete, or delayed. Families sometimes waited weeks to report their loved ones missing, unsure whether they were in danger or simply drifting. Officers who received these reports faced thousands of cases, few leads, and often nothing to suggest foul play. Even if someone suspected something darker, there was no evidence, no body, no crime scene, just absence. But behind that absence, somewhere in the isolated flatlands of the developing West Mesa, someone was digging. Between 2003 and 2005, the killer returned again and again to the same general area, an undeveloped stretch of desert west of Albuquerque. At the time, the land was largely barren, dotted with scrub and crossed by a maze of dirt paths used by off-road vehicles. Construction crews had begun preliminary grading in some areas, but the housing boom had not yet reached full speed. It was quiet there, isolated, remote enough that no one would notice someone unloading heavy objects from a vehicle under cover of darkness. No one would question the sound of a shovel. No one would hear a scream. Investigators would later estimate that at least 11 women and one unborn child were buried in shallow graves during those years. The killer seemed to choose victims from similar circumstances. Young women between 15 and 32, many of them Hispanic, many struggling with drug addiction or working in prostitution. They were vulnerable, alone, easy to lure or overpower, easy to dispose of. The disappearances continued until around 2006, and then, suddenly, the burials stopped. Development had reached the West Mesa by then. Trucks, surveyors, planners, and workers had begun carving new streets into the desert. Houses were being framed. A brand new subdivision rose slowly from the dust. The killer may have realized the area was no longer safe. He may have moved his dumping ground, or if investigators are correct about one potential suspect, he may have died. But in 2006, the burial site went silent. Then the economy collapsed in 2008. Construction halted. Streets ended abruptly in open desert. Concrete foundations sat unfinished. The lots became wastelands of weeds and broken equipment. And when the rains came that year, pooling against newly built drainage systems, the soil shifted. The temporary retention pond formed right above the burial site. Slowly, over months, water eroded the sand, weakening the shallow graves. Bones began to rise. On that February morning, once officers confirmed that the bone was human, they began cordoning off a wide area around the discovery site. By the next day, homicide detectives, forensic anthropologists, evidence technicians, and cadaver dogs were searching the desert. What happened next stunned even seasoned investigators. Within 48 hours, multiple sets of remains were located. A skull, a pelvis, a femur. Each find led to another, like stepping stones across the desert floor. Detectives immediately began creating a grid, marking coordinates, documenting every inch of disturbed soil. Anthropologists knelt in the dirt, brushing sand away from bone fragments and brittle strands of hair. The dry climate had preserved many remains better than expected, but decomposition still made identification difficult. There were no clothing items left intact, no personal belongings, no fingerprints, no clear signs of cause of death. The killer had left almost nothing behind. Not by meticulous planning necessarily, but because time and environment had stripped away everything. As the scale of the discovery became obvious, the media descended on the West Mesa. Helicopters hovered above. News vans lined the roads. Families who had lost daughters in the early 2000s rushed to the site, desperate for answers. Some of them waited at the police line, clinging to the hope that perhaps their loved one would not be among the dead. Others prayed that their daughter's remains would finally be found, that at least the waiting would end. Detectives worked around the clock. They sifted through dirt by hand, cataloged bone fragments, and searched the entire mesa for additional graves. When the final tally came, 11 women, plus the fetus, the city went silent. This was no isolated crime. This was systematic, consistent, planned. A serial killer had been operating in Albuquerque for years, unnoticed, undetected, leaving at least a dozen women buried less than 3 miles from houses, neighborhoods, lives going on as usual. The timeline became the investigators' first priority. They reconstructed the approximate burial years based on soil stratification and the dating of storm layers. Most graves seemed to originate between 2001 and 2005. If that was accurate, then the killer had likely remained active in Albuquerque throughout that period. Detectives began cross-referencing every missing person report filed during those years. They looked into phone records, drug networks, prostitution rings, homeless shelters, and known predators in the region. But early leads went nowhere. One caller claimed he knew who the killer was, but he vanished before police could interview him. Another lead pointed toward a suspected trafficker, but his alibi checked out. A third tip suggested a connection to an out-of-state serial killer, but timelines didn't match. Rumors spread, theories multiplied, and investigators found themselves buried under false leads almost as deep as the desert graves. Inside the police command center, detectives pinned photos of missing women to a corkboard. They mapped their last known locations. They traced their movements through known hangouts on East Central Avenue, places like motels, alleys, gas stations, street corners. Patterns began to emerge. Many had last been seen near the same corridors. Many had been in contact with the same small network of pimps, dealers, and acquaintances. But no single person connected them all. No one stood out clearly as the link. Then, in mid-investigation, a forensic team uncovered something startling in the burial area: a small, weathered tree tag. Its plastic surface was cracked, but a nursery name was still visible. At first glance, it meant nothing. It could have been trash. It could have blown in from anywhere. But the tag matched a specific nursery in Albuquerque. And that nursery had a very interesting customer around the time of the killings. A man who lived less than 3 miles from the burial site. A man already on police radar for his history with sex workers. And when detectives looked deeper into his background, they made a chilling discovery. Something that made their hearts stop. Something that suggested this man might have been far closer to the graves than anyone realized. And then investigators found something that changed everything. The discovery of that small plastic tree tag might have seemed insignificant at first, just another piece of debris buried under years of shifting sand, but to investigators, it became a thread worth pulling. The tag led back to a local nursery on the city's east side, a place that sold landscaping plants to residents and small contractors. When detectives dug into the purchase records, they found a familiar name. Someone already tangled in rumors, someone whose history forced investigators to stop and re-examine everything they thought they knew about the case. His name appeared repeatedly, associated with trees bought around the same years the victims were buried, and detectives began to construct a psychological profile around it, trying to understand whether this man matched the type of predator they were dealing with. But even as they followed this lead, they knew they needed more than a name. They needed a pattern. They needed proof. The FBI had already been brought in, helping Albuquerque police build a behavioral profile. The killer, they believed, was someone familiar with the West Mesa, someone comfortable enough to drive out into the dark desert with a body in the back of a vehicle, someone who knew those dirt roads well before development crews carved them into future neighborhoods. The burial methods suggested organization. The shallow graves were positioned in a way that implied planning rather than panic. This was someone with confidence, someone who felt safe out there, someone who believed these women would not be missed. The victims had similar backgrounds: sex work, addiction, unstable housing, all traits that sadly made them easier targets. Behavioral analysts described the killer as predatory, opportunistic, possibly someone with a history of violence or deep resentment toward women who fit a specific profile. This was not a spree. This was methodical. But building a profile was easier than finding a suspect. The remains offered almost nothing. No clothing, no DNA from the killer, no ligature evidence, no weapons, no signs of a specific cause of death. Years under the desert sun had stripped the bodies of almost everything forensic teams could have used. Unable to determine exact causes of death, investigators could only assume strangulation or suffocation based on patterns common in similar cases nationwide. The lack of forensic evidence frustrated everyone involved. Even experienced anthropologists admitted that the desert had swallowed too much. So investigators turned their focus toward individuals who might have had opportunities and motives. One of the first major persons of interest was Lorenzo Montoya, a man with a violent history involving sex workers. He lived less than 3 miles from the burial site in a trailer on the west side. Back in 2006, dirt trails near his residence led straight toward the area where many of the graves were later found. Even more telling, Montoya had been arrested multiple times for assaulting sex workers and had allegedly told his girlfriend he would kill her and bury her in lime. Co-workers also claimed he had mentioned burying women on the West Mesa. None of this was proof, but it was enough to raise eyebrows. Then, in December of 2006, Montoya strangled a teenage sex worker inside his trailer. The woman's boyfriend, waiting outside, heard her screams, rushed in, and ended up shooting Montoya to death. And after Montoya's death, something chilling happened. The disappearances stopped. Investigators couldn't ignore that timeline. But correlation was not proof, and without forensic evidence linking Montoya to the graves, the case against him remained circumstantial. Some detectives believed he was the killer. Others argued that the burial method seemed too organized for Montoya, describing him as impulsive rather than strategic. And with him dead, they could no longer interrogate him, investigate him properly, or test his DNA against evidence that no longer existed. For some, he remained the prime suspect. For others, he was simply one possible answer in a case full of shadows. The second major suspect emerged later: Joseph Blea, a man with a sinister and well-documented history. Blea was known as the mid-school rapist for a series of crimes during the 1980s in which he broke into the homes of teenage girls and assaulted them. For decades, he evaded serious consequences. He also had a known pattern of targeting sex workers. His DNA was found on one woman murdered in 2015, long after the West Mesa burials. When investigators searched his home in connection to that case, they found a disturbing collection of women's underwear and jewelry, none belonging to his wife or daughter. The items appeared to be trophies, the kind serial offenders sometimes keep. More unsettling, a cellmate later told investigators that Blea had confessed to hiring some of the victims now known to be buried on the West Mesa. But Blea denied everything, claimed the cellmate was lying, and insisted he had no involvement in the murders. Once again, the evidence was disturbing but not definitive. Finding trophies in someone's home raises suspicion, but without DNA, without physical items found in the graves, without direct links, investigators had no legal grounds for charging him in the West Mesa murders. Another suspect, a photographer named Ron Irwin, had his home in Missouri searched in 2010 after police learned he had photographed women at the New Mexico State Fair and possessed tens of thousands of images. Investigators flew out, examined his property, and seized his collection. But after extensive review, Irwin was cleared. Another lead collapsed. Another possible path ended in a dead end. Still, detectives persisted. They built a timeline. They constructed victim lists. They mapped known prostitution corridors in the early 2000s. They interviewed former pimps, former traffickers, former associates of the victims. They looked into drug networks operating in Albuquerque's East Central Corridor, a stretch of road notorious for crime, trafficking, and exploitation. Over and over, they heard rumors about a man who prowled the streets in a truck, offering rides or deals or drugs, someone who knew how to make women disappear. But every time they ran down the rumor, they found nothing solid. The truck belonged to someone who had left town, or it matched 3 different men, or the woman telling the story couldn't recall the year, the season, or the location. Hearsay was constant, evidence was not. Behind the scenes, investigators reviewed the burial patterns. The graves were not deep. They were not professionally concealed. They were clustered in a loose arc, spaced apart, but not randomly scattered. This suggested the killer returned to the same general area multiple times, likely because he had scouted it, knew it was isolated, and trusted the environment to hide his crimes. Criminal psychologists pointed to an organized offender, someone who planned the abductions or killings, someone who transported the bodies at night, someone who understood the risk of being seen. The fact that he targeted vulnerable women suggested a predatory mindset driven by dominance, control, and the belief that these women existed outside society's protection. Forensic psychologists would later describe this pattern as consistent with sexually motivated serial killers who focus on high-risk victims, individuals whose disappearances are less likely to trigger rapid investigations. The psychological term used was targeted opportunism, where the killer selects victims not because of personal connection, but because of vulnerability. The deeper investigators went, the more they uncovered systemic failures. Many missing persons reports involving sex workers had never been fully investigated. Some were filed late. Some were dismissed as voluntary runaway cases. Others never made it past preliminary logs. Back in the early 2000s, police resources were stretched thin, and sex workers were often seen as transient, unreliable, or uninterested in cooperating with authorities. This made them easy prey. It also made the killer nearly invisible. Months into the investigation, detectives experienced their first major shift in strategy. They released photographs of unidentified women, 7 in total, who might have been connected to the killer. Some images appeared to show the women unconscious. Investigators never publicly explained how these photos were obtained, which only deepened public speculation. Within days, 2 of the women were identified as alive. That discovery opened a new possibility. The killer may have targeted more women who narrowly escaped, or he may have interacted with individuals who could help reconstruct his identity, but tracking them down proved difficult. Some had moved states, some refused to talk, others simply vanished into new lives. By 2010, leads slowed. The reward was raised to $100,000. Crime Stoppers lines rang with tips, but almost all were dead ends. Detectives spent years revisiting evidence, re-interviewing individuals, examining the burial site again, and working with federal agencies. No DNA, no confessions, no witnesses, no arrests. And then came the moment that left investigators both hopeful and frustrated. A confession from a violent offender reported by a cellmate that he had purchased the services of multiple women buried on the West Mesa. But without corroboration, without physical proof, without direct connection, the confession was legally useless. The truth dangled just out of reach, as if the killer's shadow hovered inches beyond what the law could touch. By the time investigators stepped back and examined the case as a whole, one realization chilled them more than anything else. The killer might still be alive, still living in Albuquerque, still free. And the darkest possibility of all lingered over everything they had uncovered. The West Mesa might not be the only burial ground, but the truth was even darker than investigators imagined. When investigators began piecing together the puzzle of the West Mesa murders, they were forced to confront a reality they hadn't dared articulate publicly. The more they analyzed the burial site, the spacing of the graves, the intervals between the disappearances, and the patterns among the victims, the more one terrifying possibility grew clearer. The West Mesa was not just a graveyard, it was a graveyard that had reached its capacity. The killer might have simply moved on when development intruded. He might have found another stretch of desert, another patch of woods, another riverbed. The truth, as cold and unforgiving as the sand that buried those 11 women, was that the killer might not have stopped killing at all. He may have just changed locations. As forensic teams completed their work on the mesa, they told detectives something chilling. Based on soil disturbances and natural erosion patterns, it appeared that at least 1 or 2 potential grave depressions had been destroyed by construction equipment years earlier, long before Christine Ross found the first bone. If true, this meant that some victims might have been unearthed accidentally and lost without ever being recognized as human remains. It also meant the number of victims could be larger than the 11 confirmed. Detectives had no way to prove it, but they had no way to dismiss it either. With no primary suspect definitively linked to the graves, investigators turned their attention to motive and psychology. Forensic psychologists concluded that the killer likely had a specific preference for women engaged in street-level sex work. This type of offender often harbors deep resentment toward women in general, or toward a particular type of woman he associates with past trauma or perceived betrayal. He might have grown up around addiction, instability, or abuse. He might have had early experiences with rejection or humiliation. Or he could have been someone who learned to mask his cruelty behind a seemingly ordinary life. Serial predators who target high-risk victims often lead double lives, maintaining jobs, families, or stable routines while committing acts of violence in the shadows. The West Mesa killer's ability to evade detection suggested he was organized, calm, methodical, and familiar with both the geography of Albuquerque and the behaviors of the women he preyed upon. He understood when they were alone. He understood when no one was looking. He understood how society overlooked them. But just as important as understanding the killer's psychology was understanding the vulnerabilities of the victims, not in a blaming way, but in a way that forces society to acknowledge reality. These women lived at the intersection of addiction, poverty, and exploitation. Many lacked stable housing or strong support networks. Some drifted between motels and abandoned buildings along East Central Avenue. Others cycled in and out of jail on solicitation or drug charges. Their families loved them deeply, but often struggled to maintain contact. In that environment, a predator could strike with near impunity. A missed phone call, a broken promise to visit home, a broken promise to visit home, a 2-day silence. These things could be brushed off as part of the lifestyle, and the killer knew that. He counted on it. He preyed on it. Investigators, looking back, saw warning signs that were tragically easy to dismiss at the time. A cluster of disappearances between 2003 and 2005. Families who reported their daughters missing and felt brushed aside. Sex workers who murmured about dangerous men offering rides, but whose warnings rarely reached official reports. Women who said they'd been followed or who ran from cars that slowed beside them. These were red flags. But this world was full of red flags. Detectives later admitted that if the victims had been from wealthier neighborhoods, from more protected worlds, the pattern might have been recognized sooner. This wasn't just a failure of policing, it was a failure of society's priorities. When the remains were finally identified, families were forced to confront the brutal truth they had feared for years. The young women they loved were gone. Their stories, their struggles, their hopes for recovery or a better life ended in shallow graves on a dusty mesa. The city of Albuquerque held memorials. Volunteers built crosses. Families brought flowers, photographs, and prayers. They spoke at vigils, calling for justice, begging for answers. Some forgave. Some screamed in anger. All of them lived with the same unbearable weight, knowing the killer walked free. The police department formed a dedicated task force. They revisited old case files. They examined prior arrests of both Montoya and Blea, as well as other men accused of violence against sex workers. They looked into human trafficking networks that had grown in the early 2000s. They mapped connections between victims, not just their movements, but their relationships, their associates, their final known interactions. They consulted with out-of-state agencies, hoping for links to serial offenders active in Arizona, Colorado, Texas, and beyond. They found similarities but never found the definitive thread they needed. Years passed, and the investigation grew colder. New detectives inherited old files. New theories rose, gained traction, then faded. The city changed. Neighborhoods grew. Construction expanded again across the West Mesa. Houses now stand near the burial site. Children play in yards just a short walk from where the graves were found. Time pushed the horror into memory, but families never forgot. And neither did investigators who knew the case, still sat unsolved on their desks. In 2018, when additional bones were found near the original burial area, hope surged again, until forensic analysis revealed the remains were ancient, unrelated to the murders. Another false alarm, another echo of the past. Today, the West Mesa murders remain one of the largest unsolved serial killing cases in American history. Detectives still receive tips. The reward still stands at $100,000. Crime Stoppers still takes calls. And the question haunts everyone who has ever stood on that dusty ground. Is the killer still out there? Investigators say it is entirely possible. Whether it was Montoya, Blea, or someone never publicly named, the absence of proof means the door remains open. The families of the victims continue to advocate for justice. Some push for broader protections for sex workers, access to safe reporting systems, harm reduction services, and opportunities to escape exploitation. Others demand more resources for missing persons cases, especially those involving individuals with unstable housing. Their voices highlight a painful truth. These killings were not inevitable. They were enabled. Enabled by poverty, addiction, stigma, and the belief that certain lives matter less. That belief is a lie, and the West Mesa murders expose it with unbearable clarity. The broader implications of the case extend far beyond Albuquerque. Nationwide, serial killers who target high-risk victims often go undetected for years. They exploit systemic weaknesses, lack of coordination between agencies, overworked police departments, dismissive attitudes towards sex workers, and the complex barriers victims face when seeking help. The West Mesa case teaches a vital lesson about human behavior and societal responsibility. Predators thrive in silence. They thrive when victims feel unseen. They thrive when institutions fail to act. The moral is simple, yet heavy. A society is judged not by how it treats the powerful, but by how it protects the vulnerable. These women deserved safety. They deserved safety. They deserved justice. They deserved to be found before their bodies lay hidden under desert sand. If their story teaches anything, it is this. When we overlook the people who need us most, we create the darkness where monsters hide. The West Mesa itself has changed. The graves are quiet now. But the truth still waits beneath the surface, waiting for the one voice, the one tip, the one confession that could finally break this case open. Until then, the killer remains a shadow moving through time, unseen, untouched, and unpunished. And somewhere out there, the West Mesa Bone Collector may still walk among us,